Rome, January of 404 AD. The sun has not yet cleared the eastern wall of the Colosseum, but the tunnels beneath the arena floor are already loud with the sounds of preparation, iron on stone. Leather straps pull tight. The low murmur of men who have learned that talking before a fight is better than thinking. A man named Tetrites is standing in the hypogeum, the network of underground corridors and chambers that runs beneath the sand above. He is 31 years old. He has fought 19 times in this arena and survived every bout. He is a murmillo, a heavy-class fighter who carries a gladius short sword and a tall rectangular shield, and wears a helmet with a broad brim and a fish-shaped crest that marks his type the way a uniform marks a regiment. He has killed 7 men on the sand above him. He has been beaten twice, and both times the crowd granted him missio, the mercy signal that meant he had fought well enough to deserve his life even in defeat. The scars on his arms and legs are a map of 19 fights, each one a line drawn by a blade that came close enough to open him, but not close enough to finish him. He is among the most experienced gladiators still fighting. That distinction means less than it once did. The arena above him is half full, 20,000 spectators in a building designed for 50,000. The upper tiers are nearly empty. The senators' seats near the arena floor are occupied, but without the density or the energy that Tetrites remembers from his early career. The crowd has thinned the way a river thins during drought, gradually, visibly, with a memory of what it once was, making the present diminishment feel like a judgment. The Emperor Honorius is not in attendance. He has not attended the games in years. He is a Christian. He finds the spectacle distasteful. He has said so publicly. But he has not banned it, because banning the games would require a political confrontation with the Roman aristocracy and the Roman public that Honorius, governing from Ravenna rather than Rome, does not have the appetite to provoke. The games continue because they have always continued, because the infrastructure exists, because the trainers still produce fighters and the editors still sponsor spectacles and the crowds still come, diminished but present, drawn by habit and tradition, and the deep Roman conviction that the arena is what makes Rome, Rome. Tetrites does not know that today is the last day. He does not know that a monk is sitting somewhere in the stands above him, a man who has traveled from the eastern provinces with an intention that will change everything that happens on this sand. He does not know that the gate he is about to walk through will open for the last time in the history of an arena that has been killing men for over 3 centuries. He knows only what he has always known on the mornings before a fight, that the gate will open, that the sand will be bright after the darkness of the tunnels, that somewhere on the other side of that brightness is a man he has never met who has been trained to open his body with sharpened metal, and that the crowd above them will watch it happen the way crowds have watched it happen in this building since the year 80, when the Colosseum opened its doors and began consuming human lives at a pace that would not stop for 324 years. What happened in the arena that day ended something that had killed an estimated 400,000 people across 5 centuries. The final game. The last men to fight and bleed and die on sand that had absorbed more blood than any ground in human history. Their names survive only in fragments. Their stories have been buried beneath the mythology that transformed the arena from a slaughterhouse into a symbol of ancient glory. This is what actually happened to them. You know the gladiator, or you think you do. The image is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it feels like memory rather than fiction. The muscled warrior standing in golden light, the roaring crowd, the emperor's thumb, the hero who fights for freedom and earns it through combat so magnificent that even his captors are forced to acknowledge his greatness. That image is a story. The reality was different in ways that matter. By 404 AD, the gladiatorial games were a dying institution, clinging to life through institutional momentum rather than genuine public demand. Christianity had been the official religion of the Roman Empire for nearly 80 years. The faith that now governed Roman spiritual life explicitly condemned the killing of human beings for entertainment. Multiple emperors had attempted to end the games. Constantine issued the first prohibition in 325. It was ignored. His successors issued their own restrictions, each one chipping at the edges of the spectacle without delivering the blow that would bring it down. The games were too deeply woven into Roman identity. Removing them felt like removing something structural from a civilization that was already losing pieces faster than it could replace them. The result was a long decline rather than a sudden end. The great training schools that had once operated across the empire, producing elite fighters through years of specialized instruction, had contracted or closed. The lanistae, the trainers who had once commanded the respect and the fees of men managing valuable assets, had seen their profession diminish alongside the spectacles it served. The supply chains that had imported exotic animals from Africa and Asia for the beast hunts had fractured as Roman control over its distant provinces weakened. The elaborate mechanical stage effects that had once transformed the arena floor into forests and lakes and mythological landscapes had been simplified or abandoned as the budgets contracted. The gladiators who remained were a diminished version of what the arena had once produced. Fewer volunteers, men who had once chosen the arena for the money and the fame and the strange celebrity that successful fighters enjoyed. More condemned criminals and prisoners of war whose presence in the arena was a sentence rather than a career. The fighters had less training, less skill, and less of the technical artistry that had once made gladiatorial combat a spectacle worth crossing the empire to witness. They died more quickly and less dramatically. The crowd noticed. The crowd always notices when the product declines. But the sand was still real. The swords were still sharp. A man fighting in the Colosseum in 404 faced the same fundamental reality as a man fighting under Nero or Trajan. 2 bodies, 2 weapons, a space enclosed by walls too high to climb, and a crowd that had paid to watch one of those bodies stop moving. The pageantry had faded. The economics had contracted. The cultural enthusiasm had cooled. But the iron had not cooled. And the men who carried it into the arena that January morning carried it, knowing that the diminished state of the games did not diminish the sharpness of the blade coming toward them. If you want to know who those men were, what they carried onto the sand, what happened to each of them during the final bouts ever fought in the Colosseum, and what became of them after an institution that had defined their lives was abolished overnight, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button because what I am about to reveal are the individual human stories buried beneath the mythology. Stay until the end because the way the games ended was stranger and more disturbing than any gladiatorial combat ever staged on that sand. To understand what the arena had become by its final day, you need to understand what it had been at its peak and how completely it had deteriorated in the century before it closed. The Colosseum opened in 80 AD under the Emperor Titus with 100 consecutive days of games that killed an estimated 9,000 animals and an unknown number of gladiators. The building itself was an engineering statement. 50,000 seats arranged in tiers that sorted Roman society by class. Senators at the bottom, commoners at the top, women and slaves highest of all. a retractable awning system called the velarium that shaded the crowd from the sun, operated by a detachment of sailors from the imperial fleet. An underground network of tunnels, cages, and elevator platforms that could deliver fighters, animals, and stage scenery to the arena surface through trapdoors that opened without warning, producing spectacles that seemed to materialize from the earth itself. At its peak, under emperors like Trajan and Commodus, the Colosseum was the center of Roman public life. Trajan celebrated his Dacian victories in 107, with games lasting 123 days involving 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals. The numbers were political statements. The scale of the spectacle demonstrated the scale of the emperor's power. The gladiators who fought in these peak-era games were professional athletes trained to a standard that modern combat sports would recognize. They ate specialized diets. They trained daily under expert supervision. They received medical care from physicians whose surgical instruments, recovered by archaeologists from gladiator barracks at Pompeii, were as sophisticated as anything the Roman military produced. By 404, almost none of this infrastructure remained functional. The great training school adjacent to the Colosseum, the Ludus Magnus, still operated, but at a fraction of its former capacity. The specialized diets had been replaced by basic rations. The expert trainers had been replaced by men whose qualifications were availability rather than excellence. The medical facilities still existed beneath the arena, but the physicians who staffed them served fewer fighters with less expertise than their predecessors. The games themselves had contracted in every dimension. Where Trajan had staged spectacles lasting months, the games of the early 5th century lasted days at most. Where peak-era programs had featured dozens of bouts with carefully matched fighters representing every gladiatorial class, the late programs offered a handful of bouts with whatever fighters the Laniste could assemble. The animal hunts had shrunk from thousands of exotic beasts to whatever could be sourced from the diminished supply networks. The midday executions of condemned criminals continued because criminals were the one resource the late empire had in abundance. The spectacle had become a skeleton of itself, the bones of the original structure visible, but the flesh and the energy and the purpose that had once animated it largely gone. The Colosseum had been damaged by an earthquake in 350 and repaired with materials and craftsmanship inferior to the original construction. Sections of seating had been closed. The velarium system that had once shaded the entire arena was no longer maintained. The mechanical elevator platforms in the hypogeum, which had once lifted animals and fighters through the arena floor with theatrical precision, operated intermittently. The building was aging the way the empire was aging, visibly, irreversibly. With the memory of what it had been making, the reality of what it had become feel like evidence of a decline that everyone could see and no one could reverse. This was the arena that opened its gates on a January morning in 404. Not the Golden Colosseum of Hollywood, not the roaring theater of imperial power at its zenith. A tired building half full of spectators watching a diminished program of fights between men who were the last practitioners of a profession that their civilization had already decided was wrong but had not yet found the will to stop. The men who walked through the tunnels beneath the arena that morning represented every path that led a human being onto the sand. Some had chosen to be there. Some had been condemned to it. All of them carried weapons. They had been trained to use on bodies identical to their own. The gladiatorial system classified its fighters the way a military classifies its units, by equipment, by function, by the tactical role each type played against the type it was designed to face. The Murmillo was the heavy fighter. the anchor of the gladiatorial roster for centuries. He carried a gladius, the short-thrusting sword that had conquered an empire, and a large rectangular shield called a scutum that covered him from shoulder to knee. His helmet was broad-brimmed, with a fish-shaped crest, a design so iconic that graffiti artists scratched it into walls across the Roman world, the way modern fans paint team logos on their cars. The Murmillo fought from behind his shield, absorbing attacks, waiting for the moment when his opponent overextended, then stepping forward with a thrust aimed at the abdomen or the thigh. He was slow. He was heavy. He was exhausting to fight, because killing him required getting past a wall of bronze and wood that he had spent years learning to make impenetrable. Tetrades was a Murmillo, 31 years old, 19 fights. His name appears in the historical record because gladiator names were preserved in graffiti, mosaics, and the inscriptions that fans scratched into stone with the same obsessive devotion that modern supporters bring to stadium walls. He was a professional, a volunteer who had entered the arena because the alternative, whatever life the late Roman economy offered a man without land or prospects, was worse than the risk of death in exchange for money, food, medical care, and a fame that transcended social class. The Thraex was the Murmillo's traditional opponent, a lighter fighter carrying a curved blade called a sica, designed to hook around the edge of a shield and strike the arm or shoulder behind it. His shield was small and square, offering less protection but more mobility. The Thraex fought with angles and movement, circling the Murmillo, looking for the gap between shield and helmet where the sica could reach flesh. Priscus was a Thraex, older than Tetrades, nearing the end of a career that the records suggest had been long and competent rather than spectacular. A man who had survived by being good enough to win and smart enough to know when winning was not possible and submission was the better choice. The Retiarius was the most unusual fighter in the arena. He carried no sword. He wore almost no armor. His weapons were a weighted net and a three-pronged trident, tools borrowed from fishing and adapted to the business of killing men. He fought at distance, using the net to entangle his opponent and the trident to strike while the opponent was immobilized. If the net missed, the Retiarius was nearly defenseless at close range against an armored fighter. The class attracted young men because it rewarded speed over strength, and because its dramatic vulnerability made a successful retiari famous faster than any other type. Hermes was a retiarius, 19 years old. 2 fights behind him, both victories. He had killed twice. He was new enough that the weight of those killings had not yet settled into the place where experienced fighters learned to store such things. The Secutor was built to kill the Retiarius, heavily armored with a smooth, rounded helmet designed to resist the net's entanglement. He carried a gladius and a large shield, the same equipment as the Murmillo but with a helmet that sacrificed visibility for protection. The Secutor's eye holes were small, barely larger than coins, limiting his vision to a narrow field directly ahead. He fought half-blind, relying on sound and training to track an opponent he could barely see. Columbus was a Secutor. His designation in the records marks him as a condemned man, a criminal or prisoner of war sentenced to the arena, rather than a professional who had chosen it. He fought because the alternative was execution without the possibility of reprieve. For a condemned fighter, there was no missio, no mercy from the crowd. He won or he died. There was no third option. 4 men, 4 paths to the same sand, a veteran, a professional, a newcomer, and a condemned man. What happened to each of them that day is the story of the Colosseum's final hours. The night before the games, the gladiators were displayed. The Cena Libera, the free feast, was a tradition as old as the arena itself. The fighters were brought to a public space, usually a hall near the Colosseum or in the Forum, and fed a lavish meal in full view of spectators who came not to celebrate the men, but to evaluate them. It was a cattle show. The crowd circulated among the tables, assessing builds, studying scars, measuring the confidence or fear in a fighter's eyes. Wagers were placed based on what the spectators observed. A man who ate heartily and met the crowd's gaze was favored. A man who picked at his food and stared at the table was not. Tetrates had attended 18 of these feasts before. He knew how to perform the role the crowd expected. He ate, he drank, moderately. He let spectators examine the scars on his arms and told the stories behind them when asked, which they always were, because a gladiator's scars were his credentials and the crowd read them the way an employer reads a letter of reference. Priscus, the aging Thrax, did the same. 2 veterans performing normalcy the night before, a day that might kill them, managing the crowd's expectations while managing their own fear in whatever private space their experience had taught them to maintain. Hermes, the young Retiarius, had attended 2 previous feasts. His inexperience was visible in ways the crowd could read. He ate quickly. He laughed too loudly at things that were not funny. He displayed the nervous energy of a young man who had not yet learned that the performance of calm was as important as the fighting itself, because a gladiator who appeared afraid attracted a crowd that wanted to see him fail. Columbus, the condemned secutor, ate what was placed before him with the mechanical efficiency of a man fueling a body he might not inhabit tomorrow. The crowd did not linger at his table. Condemned fighters drew less interest because their bouts had predetermined stakes. He would win or die. The crowd could not influence his fate with the Missio signal. There was nothing to wager on except survival itself. The morning began before dawn. The gladiators were woken in their cells beneath the arena and led to the armoring rooms. The process was ritualized to a degree that 3 centuries of repetition had refined into something closer to ceremony than preparation. Each fighter was attended by assistants who knew the equipment of his class the way a priest knows the vestments of his office. Straps tightened in a specific order, armor pieces fitted in a specific sequence. The helmet placed last because a helmeted gladiator could not see clearly in the dim tunnels and needed his full vision until the final moments before the gate opened. The weapons were inspected by the editor, the sponsor of the games, who ran his thumb along each blade and tested each trident point and weighed each net in his hands. The inspection was practical rather than ceremonial. A weapon that failed during a bout was an embarrassment to the editor who had sponsored it. The crowd expected clean kills and dramatic combat, both of which required functional equipment. The editor approved the weapons and withdrew. The gladiators were left in the tunnels with their attendants and with the sounds filtering down from above as the Colosseum filled. The morning program proceeded above them. Animal displays that had once featured lions and elephants and rhinoceroses, imported from across the known world, but that now featured whatever the diminished supply chains could provide. The midday executions, condemned criminals killed in the arena as both punishment and entertainment. Comic interludes featuring mismatched fighters whose bouts were designed to provoke laughter rather than awe. The sounds of the crowd's reactions filtered through the stone and sand to the tunnels below, each cheer and each silence, marking the passage of the program toward the moment when the preliminary acts would end and the gates would open for the men who waited beneath. The gate opened, and the sand was blinding. Every gladiator who ever fought in the Colosseum described the same sensation in the graffiti and inscriptions that survive. The tunnels were dark. The arena was bright. The transition between them was a violence done to the eyes that lasted seconds. But that felt like the crossing of a border between one world and another. Below was stone and shadow and the smell of animal cages. Above was light and noise, and 50,000 seats, half of them empty today, arranged in a bowl that focused the sound of 20,000 voices into a pressure that a fighter felt on his skin before he heard it in his ears. Tetrates emerged first. The Murmillo's entrance was traditionally unhurried. The heavy fighter walked onto the sand with the measured pace of a man carrying 50 pounds of equipment, who understood that energy spent walking was energy unavailable for fighting. His shield was on his left arm. His gladius was in his right hand, held low along his thigh. His helmet, with its fish-shaped crest, caught the January light. He crossed to the center of the arena and stood. His opponent came through the opposite gate, a Thraex whose name does not survive in any record. He is identified only by his class and by his presence on the program for that day. He was younger than Tetrates. His equipment was lighter. His curved psyche was already in his hand, the blade catching light along its inner edge. He moved faster than Tetrates because his armor permitted speed that the Murmillo's equipment did not. The contrast was the point. Every gladiatorial pairing was designed to create visual and tactical opposition. The heavy against the light. The shield against the blade. The man who waited against the man who moved. They faced the editor's box and raised their weapons in salute. The ritual words were spoken. The editor dropped the signal, and 20,000 people leaned forward in their seats as two men began the process of trying to open each other's bodies with sharpened metal. The Thraex moved first. He circled to Tetrates' right, away from the shield, probing with short feinting strikes designed to draw the Murmillo's guard out of position. The psyche's curve was its advantage and its limitation. It could hook around the edge of a shield and reach the arm behind it, but only if the shield was extended far enough to create the angle the hook required. Tetrates did not extend. 19 fights had taught him that the Murmillo's shield was his life, and that the moment it moved beyond the center line of his body was the moment the Sika would find his arm. He kept the scutum close, absorbing the feints against its face, waiting. The Thraex escalated. A committed strike aimed at the helmet, designed to force Tetrates to raise his shield and expose his legs. Tetrates raised the shield. The Psyche glanced off its upper edge. In the same motion, Tetrates stepped forward and punched the shield into the Thraex's chest. The scutum was not just a defensive tool. It was a weapon. 40 pounds of wood and bronze driven forward by a man who had spent years learning to use his body's weight behind it. The Thraex staggered. Tetrates followed with a gladius thrust, aimed low, at the thigh below the Thraex's small shield. The blade found flesh, not deep, not fatal, but enough to open a wound that would bleed and that would slow the younger man's movement, which was the only advantage he had. The Thraex fought on, blood on the sand beneath his right leg. His circles grew smaller as the wound stiffened. His strikes grew more desperate as the arithmetic of the bout shifted against him. Blood loss reduced endurance. Reduced endurance slowed movement. Slowed movement made him easier to hit. Each exchange brought him closer to the moment when his body could not sustain the fight his will demanded. It came after 12 minutes. The Thrax lunged with a strike aimed at the gap between Tetrates' helmet and shoulder guard. Tetrates caught the Psyche on his shield and turned it. The Thrax stumbled forward, off balance. Tetrates struck him across the back of the leg with the flat of his gladius, a blow that dropped the younger man to one knee. The Thrax raised a finger. The submission signal. He was done. The crowd decided. 20,000 voices merging into a sound that carried a man's life in its pitch and volume. In the diminished atmosphere of 404, the verdict came quickly. Missio, mercy. The Thrax would live. He was helped to his feet by arena attendants and led through the gate of life on the eastern side. His wound would be treated in the medical station beneath the stands. He would survive the final game. He would carry a scar on his thigh for the rest of his life, and never know that the bout that produced it was among the last ever fought on that sand. The Haranari raked fresh sand over the blood from the first bout. Arena sand was not ordinary sand. It was selected for its color and its absorbency, its ability to drink blood quickly so that each bout began on a surface that looked clean, regardless of what had happened on it minutes earlier. The sand was a lie told in grain. It promised a fresh start that the men standing on it knew was fiction. Hermes came through the eastern gate. No helmet, no heavy armor, a shoulder guard on his left arm, a loincloth, and nothing else. He carried his net in his left hand and his trident in his right. 19 years old. Built for speed rather than endurance, the physique of a man whose survival depended on never letting an armored opponent get close enough to use the advantage that armor provided. Columbus came through the western gate, fully armored. Helmet with eye holes so small they reduced his vision to a narrow tunnel. Large shield. Gladius. His helmet was smooth and rounded, engineered to resist the net. Every surface curved so the weighted mesh would slide rather than catch. Columbus was condemned. A professional gladiator fought knowing that defeat did not necessarily mean death. The crowd might grant missio. A condemned fighter had no such calculation. Columbus would win or die. The crowd could not save him. This knowledge produced a fighting style that professionals feared. A man with nothing to lose took risks a professional would not take. He accepted wounds a professional would have avoided. Desperation was its own form of skill. The signal dropped. Columbus charged. The secutor's strategy was always the same. Close the distance. Get inside the net's range. Force the fight into close quarters, where armor and sword outmatched a trident wielded by an unprotected man. Hermes threw the net. A single sweeping cast that sent the weighted mesh spreading through the air. It landed across Columbus's shield and shoulder. The weights wrapped around his arm. The mesh slid across the smooth helmet exactly as designed. Columbus was entangled but not immobilized. His shield arm was restricted, his sword arm partially caught. But his legs were free, and his momentum carried him forward. Hermes thrust with the trident. The 3 points found the gap between helmet and shoulder guard, the narrow band of exposed neck that every retiarius was trained to target. The points entered. Columbus dropped. The weight of his armor drove him to the sand. The crowd's response did not matter. For a condemned man, there was no question to answer. The arena attendants approached with the heated iron pressed to fallen fighters to confirm death. He did not flinch. He was carried through the gate of death on the western side, where the dead were stripped of equipment and prepared for disposal. Columbus was the last condemned man the Colosseum would officially consume. His name survives. His crime does not. Hermes stood over the place where the body had fallen. 19 years old. 3 men killed in 3 fights. He raised his trident to a crowd that cheered with the particular enthusiasm reserved for a young fighter who had just proved his previous victories were not accidents. Let me know in the comments what you think it cost a 19-year-old to carry 3 killings, because the arena did not ask what it cost. It only asked if you could do it again. Between bouts, the Colosseum's operational machinery performed the rituals that 3 centuries of killing had refined into routine. The Haranari finished raking the sand. The Libitinarii, the death attendants, completed their work in the spolarium behind the Gate of Death, stripping Columbus's armor and weapons for reuse and preparing his body for the burial pit outside the city walls, where unclaimed dead from the arena were deposited without ceremony. His equipment was valuable. His body was not. The distinction was the arena's final judgment on the men it consumed. In the hypogeum, the surviving fighters waited. Tetrate sat on a stone bench in the corridor outside the armoring room, his helmet beside him, drinking water from a clay cup. His bout was finished. He had won. He would not fight again today. The relief of survival was something he had learned to manage across 19 fights, neither celebrating it visibly nor suppressing it entirely, letting it settle into his body the way warmth settles into stone after the sun moves past. He could hear the sounds above him. The crowd's murmur between bouts, lower and less focused than the roar during combat. The scraping of rakes on sand, the mechanical creak of the elevator platforms being reset for whatever the program required next. Hermes was in the medical station having his hands examined. The net throw had strained his left wrist. An arena physician, working with instruments that archaeological excavation has shown were comparable to the best Roman military surgical tools, manipulated the joint, testing for fracture or dislocation. Hermes had killed a man 20 minutes earlier. The physician did not ask about that. The medical station treated bodies. What those bodies had done, or what had been done to them on the sand above, was outside the physician's concerns. A wrist was a wrist. A wound was a wound. The arena compartmentalized its operations with the efficiency of any institution that depends on people performing specialized functions without contemplating the larger system those functions served. Priscus was being armored for the next bout. His attendants strapped his Thraex equipment with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times. The small square shield fitted to his left arm. The curved sica placed in his right hand. The greaves buckled to his shins. The helmet, with its distinctive griffin crest, placed last. Priscus stood in the tunnel and listened to the sounds above him, and did what every gladiator did in the minutes before the gate opened. He breathed. He managed whatever was happening inside his chest and his mind through the discipline that years of fighting had installed in him, a discipline that did not eliminate fear, but contained it in a space small enough that it did not interfere with the movements his body needed to perform. The crowd above him was restless in the way that crowds between acts are restless. Their attention unfocused, their energy scattered across conversations and food purchases and the small social transactions that filled the spaces between the violence they had come to watch. The intermission performers had finished. The program was advancing toward the next bout. The editor gave the signal to prepare. In the tunnels below, the gate mechanisms were engaged. The heavy wooden doors that separated the hypogeum from the arena surface began to move. Priscus heard the gate open before he saw the light. The sound came first, a grinding of iron and wood that every gladiator knew in his body before he knew it in his ears. Then the light, the blinding transition from darkness to sand that never became familiar no matter how many times a fighter experienced it. Priscus walked toward it. On the other side of the arena, through the opposite gate, another man was walking toward the same light. They had never met. Within minutes, one of them would be bleeding. The crowd settled into its seats. The murmur compressed into silence. The silence compressed into anticipation. And the sand waited, clean and pale, and ready to receive whatever the next few minutes would produce. Priscus entered from the eastern gate. His opponent, a Murmillo whose name survives in fragmentary records, entered from the west. Two veterans. The crowd recognized both of them. Not with the frenzied adoration that peak-era champions had commanded, but with the informed appreciation of spectators who had watched enough combat to recognize competence when they saw it. This bout was different from the one that had killed Columbus. That had been a collision between desperation and youth, decided in minutes by a single decisive strike. This was a negotiation. Two professionals who understood the economics of survival in the arena, conducting a conversation in iron and movement, each phrase calibrated to communicate without committing, to test without risking, to advance the bout toward a conclusion that satisfied the crowd while leaving both men alive to fight another day. This was the art that the late-era games had nearly lost, the technical sophistication that had once made gladiatorial combat a spectacle worth traveling across the empire to witness. Priscus circled. The Thraex always circled. His curved Sika required angles that the Murmillo's straight gladius did not. He moved to his opponent's right, away from the large shield, probing the space between the scutum's edge and the Murmillo's sword arm. The Murmillo tracked him with small adjustments of his shield, rotating his body to keep the scutum between himself and the curved blade. The movements were minimal. Neither man wasted energy. Energy was currency in the arena. Every unnecessary step was a coin spent that might be needed later. The exchanges when they came were brief and controlled. Priscus struck at the shield to test his opponent's grip. The Murmillo answered with a gladius thrust aimed at Priscus's leading leg, the standard counter that every Murmillo learned in his first months of training. Priscus read it and withdrew. The Murmillo did not pursue because pursuing a Thrax who wanted to be pursued was how Murmillos died. The pattern repeated. Strike, counter, withdrawal, reset, each exchange lasting seconds. Each exchange providing both fighters with information about the other's timing, reach, fatigue, and habits. The decisive moment came not through a dramatic stroke, but through an accumulation of small advantages. Priscus had identified a pattern in the Murmillo's shield movement, a fraction of a second, where the scutum dipped during the transition between a defensive block and an offensive thrust. The gap was tiny. A lesser fighter would not have seen it. Priscus had been fighting for years. He saw it the way a carpenter sees a joint that is not quite flush, through expertise so deep it operated below conscious thought. He created the pattern one more time, feinted at the helmet to draw the shield up, let the Murmillo counter with a gladius thrust, watched the shield dip during the transition, and hooked the Sika around its upper edge, curving the blade over the top of the scutum and catching the Murmillo's sword arm at the wrist. The Sika's edge opened a wound that ran from the base of the thumb to the middle of the forearm. The gladius dropped to the sand. The Murmillo staggered backward, his weapon hand streaming blood, his shield still raised, but his ability to fight effectively ended by a single cut to the tendons that controlled his grip. The Murmillo raised his finger. Submission. Priscus stepped back and lowered his Sika. The crowd deliberated with the casual authority of 20,000 people deciding whether a man deserved to continue breathing. The verdict was quick. Missio. Both men had fought well enough that killing either one would have been waste rather than justice. The Murmillo was led to the medical station where his wrist wound would be sutured by the arena physicians. He would live. He would likely never grip a gladius with full strength again, but he would live. Priscus walked off the sand through the gate of life. He did not know it was the last time. He did not know that the sand he left behind, freshly stained with his opponent's blood, would never receive the blood of another professional gladiatorial bout. He knew only that he had survived. Again, one more time. The calculation that every gladiator made after every fight. The quiet arithmetic of still being alive, completed once more in a career that was running out of numbers to count. The program continued. More bouts followed, fought by men whose names the fragmentary sources do not preserve, and whose individual stories are lost in the gap between what happened on the sand and what anyone considered worth recording. The afternoon advanced. The January sun tracked across the open roof of the Colosseum, casting shadows that moved across the sand like a slow hand wiping a surface clean. The crowd thinned further as the day wore on. Spectators who had seen enough left for the baths or the taverns, or the obligations that pulled them away from the arena before the program concluded. The seats that had been half empty at morning were 2/3 empty by mid-afternoon. And then a man stood up in the crowd and did something that no one in 3 centuries of games had done before. His name was Telemachus. He was a monk. He had traveled to Rome from the eastern provinces, from a monastery somewhere in the vast Christian network that had spread across the empire in the decades since Constantine made the faith official. He was not Roman. He was not accustomed to the arena. He had come to Rome specifically to see the games, because he wanted to witness what he had heard described and what he believed was an abomination before God. The killing of human beings for entertainment, the conversion of death into spectacle, the crowd paying to watch men open each other's bodies while an empire that called itself Christian looked on and applauded. Telemachus did not organize a protest. He did not circulate a petition. He did not write to the emperor or the Senate or the Bishop of Rome. He did what the simplest and most radical form of opposition has always done. He put his body in the way. During a bout between fighters whose names the sources do not record, Telemachus climbed over the barrier that separated the spectators from the arena floor. He dropped onto the sand. He ran between the 2 gladiators. He stood in the space where the killing was supposed to happen, and he begged them to stop. The sources do not preserve his exact words. Theodoret of Cyrus, the 5th century historian who provides the most detailed account, describes Telemachus as placing himself physically between the combatants and appealing to them in the name of God to put down their weapons. The crowd did not experience a moral awakening. The crowd experienced an interruption. They had paid to watch combat. A man in a monk's robe was standing on the sand preventing it. The reaction was immediate, and it was violent. Spectators began throwing objects, stones, pieces of food, whatever was at hand. The projectiles struck Telemachus from multiple directions simultaneously. He did not leave the sand. He stood where he was, between 2 armed men who had stopped fighting because a stranger had inserted himself into the space where their swords were supposed to meet. The stoning intensified. Theodoret's account is brief. The spectators killed Telemachus. They beat him to death with stones thrown from the stands. A man who had walked onto the sand to stop the killing was killed by the people who had come to watch. He died on the arena floor in the same sand that had absorbed the blood of 400,000 people across 5 centuries. He was not a gladiator. He was not a criminal. He was not condemned. He was a monk who believed that what was happening in this building was wrong, and who chose to say so in the only language the arena understood: presence, a body on the sand. The arena had always required bodies. Telemachus gave it one more, the last one. The news reached Ravenna within days. Emperor Honorius, who had not attended the games in years and who governed an empire that was fracturing faster than his administration could manage, received the report of a Christian monk stoned to death by a Roman crowd on the floor of the Colosseum. The political calculation was immediate, and it was simple. Honorius was a Christian emperor governing a Christian empire. The official faith condemned killing for entertainment. Multiple predecessors had issued bans and restrictions that had been ignored because enforcement required a confrontation with Roman tradition that no emperor had been willing to sustain. But Telemachus changed the equation. A monk was dead, killed by spectators at a pagan entertainment. The optics were catastrophic. The Christian establishment, the bishops and clergy whose support Honorius needed to maintain legitimacy, could not overlook the martyrdom of one of their own on the arena floor. The Roman public, already ambivalent about the games, could not easily defend an entertainment that had killed a man of God for asking it to stop. Honorius issued the decree. The gladiatorial games were banned permanently throughout the empire. The specific language of the decree does not survive in complete form, but its existence and its effect are confirmed by multiple sources. Theodoret credits the ban directly to Telemachus's death. Other historians have argued that the decree was part of a longer series of restrictions, and that Telemachus's martyrdom was the catalyst rather than the sole cause. The distinction matters to scholars. It did not matter to the arena. The Colosseum fell silent. The gates that had opened to deliver men onto the sand for over 3 centuries did not open again for gladiatorial combat. The machinery in the hypogeum, the elevators, and trapdoors and cage mechanisms stood idle. The Heronari, who had raked blood into pale sand after every bout, were not needed. The Libitinari, who had stripped the dead in the Spoliarium, had no dead to strip. The physicians in the medical station had no wounds to suture. The entire infrastructure of killing that the Colosseum had maintained since the year 80, the largest and most sophisticated system of human destruction ever built for the purpose of entertainment, shut down. Not with a final grand spectacle, not with a ceremony, with a monk's body on the sand and a decree from a city 300 miles away. The historical debate around the ban's effectiveness continues. Some evidence suggests that gladiatorial activity persisted in provincial arenas for years after Honorius's decree, diminishing gradually rather than stopping abruptly. The empire's ability to enforce edicts had weakened along with everything else. A ban issued from Ravenna might not reach a provincial arena for months, and when it arrived, it might be ignored by local officials who answered to local interests rather than imperial authority. But in Rome itself, in the Colosseum, the evidence is clear. The gladiatorial games ended. The animal hunts continued. The Venationes, spectacles involving the killing of wild animals in the arena, persisted for another century after human combat was banned. The last recorded hunt in the Colosseum took place in 523 AD, over 100 years after Telemachus died. The empire could surrender gladiators. It could not yet surrender spectacle entirely. The animals filled the gap, providing the blood and the death that the crowd still desired in a form that Christianity could tolerate because the victims were beasts rather than men. The moral distinction was convenient. The sand absorbed animal blood as efficiently as it had absorbed human blood. The crowd watched the killing with the same appetite. The only difference was the species dying. Drop a comment about what it means that an empire banned the killing of humans for entertainment and immediately replaced it with the killing of animals for the same purpose. Because the Colosseum did not close when the gladiators left, it simply changed what it killed. The ban ended the games. It did not end the gladiators. The men who had fought in the Colosseum's final program walked out of the arena into a world that had abolished their profession overnight. What happened to each of them is a question the sources answer only in fragments, but the fragments, combined with what is known about retired gladiators from earlier periods, allow the reconstruction of fates that varied as widely as the paths that had brought them to the sand. Tetrates, the veteran Murmillo, had survived 19 fights. His name appears in the historical record with enough frequency to suggest genuine fame within the arena's diminished, late-era celebrity culture. A man with his experience and reputation had options that lesser fighters did not. Some retired gladiators became trainers at the Lannistic schools, passing their knowledge to the next generation. But there would be no next generation. The schools would close. The training grounds would empty. The expertise that men like Tetrates had accumulated across decades of fighting would die with the men who carried it, because the civilization that had produced it had decided it no longer wanted what that expertise could do. Some veterans became bodyguards. Wealthy Romans had employed retired gladiators as personal security for centuries, valuing the combination of combat skill, physical conditioning, and the intimidation factor that a man who had killed professionally carried simply by existing in a room. Tetrates likely found employment of this kind. A man who could survive 19 bouts in the Colosseum could protect a senator's household. The skills transferred, the context did not. A gladiator guarding a doorway was using the same body and the same reflexes that had earned him fame on the sand, applied now to a purpose so mundane that the gap between what he had been and what he had become must have felt like a wound that closed but never healed. Priscus, the aging Thrax, was nearer to the end of his career when the ban arrived. He would have retired soon regardless. The ban simply accelerated a transition that was already approaching. Older gladiators who survived long enough to age out of the arena faced the same limited options as veterans in any era. Some found modest employment. Some received the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized official discharge and freedom for gladiators who had been slaves. Some lived on savings accumulated from prize money and the gifts that wealthy patrons bestowed on favored fighters. Some simply disappeared into the lower levels of Roman society, anonymous men carrying extraordinary histories in bodies that no longer attracted the attention those histories had once commanded. Hermes, the young Retiarius, had the strangest fate of all. 19 years old, 3 fights, 3 kills, a career that had barely begun before it was permanently ended. He had been trained for a profession that no longer existed. His skills, the net throw, the trident thrust, the footwork that kept an unarmored man alive against armored opponents, were useless outside the arena. He was a specialist in a discipline that had been abolished, a young man carrying the muscle memory of killing and the psychological weight of 3 deaths, and no framework in which either the skill or the weight could be put to purpose. The Roman military was an option. The legions were desperate for recruits, as the empire's borders contracted under pressure from every direction. A man who could fight could be trained to fight differently. But a legionary's combat bore little resemblance to the arena's specialized pairings. Hermes would have entered the military as a raw recruit, despite being one of the most dangerous young men in Rome. The unnamed Thrax who had lost to Tetraites and received Missio carried a scar on his thigh, and the knowledge that a crowd's mercy had saved his life on the last day mercy was available to give. Columbus carried nothing. He was in the burial pit outside the city walls, stripped of the armor that had not saved him, his body deposited among the unclaimed dead, whose names the arena recorded only for the purpose of accounting for its inventory. The Colosseum did not die when the gladiators left. It aged, slowly at first. Then, with the accelerating decay that accompanies abandonment in a civilization that is itself decaying. The animal hunts continued until 523, giving the building another century of purpose after human combat ended. Then those stopped too. The arena that had hosted continuous spectacles since 80 AD fell quiet for the first time in its existence. The silence must have been strange. A building designed to amplify sound, engineered so that 50,000 voices merged into a single pressure wave that fighters felt on their skin, standing empty. The acoustics that had carried the crowd's verdict to men on the sand now carried nothing but wind and rain, and the sounds of a city that was learning to exist without the thing that had defined it. Earthquakes accelerated the decline. A major tremor in 443 damaged the southern wall. Another in 484 caused further collapse. The repairs that followed were minimal because the empire that had built the Colosseum no longer existed in any form capable of maintaining it. Rome had been sacked by the Visigoths in 410, 6 years after the gladiatorial ban. It would be sacked again by the Vandals in 455. The city's population, which had exceeded 1 million at the empire's peak, collapsed to fewer than 50,000 by the 6th century. The Colosseum stood in a city that could no longer fill it, maintain it, or remember clearly what it had been for. The quarrying began. Romans who needed building materials discovered that the Colosseum was the largest supply of pre-cut stone in the city. The travertine blocks that had held the arena together for centuries were pried loose and carted away to construct churches, palaces, hospitals, and fortifications. The iron clamps that had joined the blocks were extracted for their metal, leaving the pockmarked holes that are visible in the Colosseum's walls today. Each missing clamp is a small wound. Together they record a process of dismantlement that continued for centuries, each generation taking what it needed from a building that no generation felt responsible for preserving. The hypogeum tunnels where Tetraites and Hermes and Priscus had waited for their gates to open, filled with earth and rubble. The arena floor collapsed into the chambers below, exposing the underground infrastructure that had been invisible to spectators for 3 centuries. The elevators that had lifted fighters and animals to the surface rusted and broke. The cage mechanisms seized. The medical station where arena physicians had sutured gladiators' wounds was buried under debris that would not be cleared for over 1,000 years. The operational machinery of killing, the physical systems that had processed human beings from living fighters into dead bodies with industrial efficiency, became archaeology. Layers of dirt covering layers of stone, covering the memories of things that had happened in these corridors that no living person would recall. The Colosseum became a ruin. Then it became a home. Medieval Romans built dwellings inside the arches and corridors. Families lived in the spaces where gladiators had been armored. Workshops operated in chambers that had once held caged animals. A small church was built into one section of the structure. The building that had been designed to kill people on the largest possible scale was converted into a place where people lived, worked, and prayed. The transformation was complete. The arena that had consumed 400,000 lives became a neighborhood. The sand that had absorbed their blood became soil. The gates that had opened to deliver men to their deaths became doorways that children ran through on their way to play in the corridors where condemned men had waited to die. The Colosseum today receives 2.7 million visitors per year. They enter through the same arches that spectators walked through in 80 AD. They stand on viewing platforms above the exposed hypogeum and look down into the tunnels where men waited for the gates to open. They photograph the ruins with phones that contain more computational power than the civilization that built the building could have imagined. They buy miniature gladiator helmets in the gift shops. They pose with men dressed in costume armor outside the entrance, paying a few euros for a photograph with a version of history that has been sanded smooth of everything that made it real. The audio guides describe the architecture, the engineering, the velarium system and the elevator platforms, and the sophisticated crowd management that allowed 50,000 people to be seated in 15 minutes. The Colosseum is presented as an achievement, and it was. It was an extraordinary achievement of engineering and logistics and organizational precision. It was also a building whose purpose was killing human beings for entertainment, and the engineering and logistics and precision were in service of that purpose. The sophistication of the machinery does not redeem the use to which it was put. It makes the use more disturbing, because it demonstrates that the killing was not primitive frenzy, but calculated industry. Rome did not stumble into the arena. Rome engineered it. The entertainment industry has completed the romanticization that the tourist industry began. Films and television series and video games recreate the arena with digital blood and choreographed combat and heroes who choose to fight and who always survive. The gladiator has been converted from a slave forced to kill for other people's amusement into an icon of warrior virtue, a symbol of courage and strength and noble defiance. The conversion required erasing everything that was true about the arena and replacing it with everything that is comfortable. The fear has been erased. The coercion has been erased. The condemned men who fought knowing they would die have been erased. The 19-year-old boy standing over the third man he has killed, carrying a weight that no 19-year-old should carry, has been replaced by a muscled hero raising his sword in triumph while the soundtrack swells. Tetrates, Priscus, Hermes, Columbus, the unnamed Thrax who survived through a crowd's mercy on the last day mercy was offered. Telemachus, the monk who walked onto the sand and died for the belief that killing people for entertainment was wrong. These men stood in this building. They bled on this sand. They lived and died inside a system that used their bodies as raw material for the production of spectacle. Their names survive in fragments, scratched into stone by fans or preserved in the margins of chronicles that consider their deaths less important than the military campaigns and political intrigues that filled the center of the page. 400,000 people died in this arena across 5 centuries. Not one of their names is on the walls. The building remembers everything about how it was built and nothing about what it was built to do. The sand is gone. The machinery is still. The gates are open, but no one walks through them toward the blinding light that every gladiator described. What remains is stone and silence, and the knowledge that for 324 years, a civilization that built roads and aqueducts and legal codes that still influence modern law also built the most sophisticated system of human slaughter ever designed for the purpose of making people cheer. The Colosseum is a monument, but it is not a monument to what the tourist guides describe. It is a monument to what human beings are willing to do to other human beings when the crowd is watching and the sand is clean and the gate is about to open. If what you have learned today matters to you, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button and the notification bell, because the stories buried beneath the mythology are the ones that need to be told. Share this video. Drop a comment telling me which fighter's fate you will remember and where you are watching from. Because these men existed, they bled, they died, and they deserve to be remembered as what they were. Not icons, not heroes, people trapped inside a machine that consumed them and called it glory. But Rome was not the only civilization that built arenas for the destruction of human beings. There is another chapter from another empire where the spectacles were different and the silence afterward was even deeper. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen.